we're going to talk about receivers in this particular session. I picked that because people always thought the receivers are hard to build. That isn't necessarily so. They may be a little more complex than a one-tube transmitter, a 6L6 transmitter, for example, using coils wound on sucker strips or something like that. But still, they can be done. And but hams have always had this feeling that the manufacturers could build a better receiver than they could. And the engineering was better, and the parts were better, and it was cheaper. Now none of those are necessarily so. The war years, we're talking World War II, that particular war, were followed by what they called the surplus years, when all of these BC 348s and 342s and all of the rest of them came on the market, and hams picked these things up, and these were great to work with, but they weren't ham band receivers. And so it went on for a few years like this, and the manufacturers got into the act early and started promoting their wares. National, Hallicrafters, RME, and so on. But then in 1957, there was a fellow named Ted Crosby, W6TC out in California, decided that, hey, I know how to build a receiver, and I'm going to build this thing, and I'm going to write it up, and I'm going to publish it. And he did. And there was the first article. It's a 14-tube double conversion receiver. This was in QST in when? July 1957. And all of a sudden, people perked up and said, my goodness gracious, now this is not a simple project at all. 14 tubes is a lot of tubes for a receiver. But his feeling was that any amateur with reasonable intelligence and could make a solder joint and knew how to use simple tools could build this thing. So people started building them, and by golly, he was right. Not only that, but the things worked well. And we'll show you why they worked well now. I'm concentrating on this particular one because this is the one I have all the information on, but the principles apply to any project that you want to build. And we'll go through this procedure, and I'll try and keep it under 20 minutes. Back then, in the 50s and 60s, parts were still readily available. Maybe they're not so readily available now. But this went on for a lot of years, and actually, this guy kept publishing, and articles, follow-up articles were published for 12 years. Now, as an interesting sideline on this particular thing, I wrote this up and published it in the January '09 issue of the journal. Coincidentally, unknown to either one of us, John Dilks also wrote it up for the old radio column at QST. And, you know, they both came out at the same time. And Mark called me up and says, how come this happened that you two guys independently came up with this esoteric subject? At any rate, so it created some interest. And John got a lot of his information from a fellow named Jay Helms out in California. Do I have that right? Jay Helms?
I think that, oh yeah.
Yeah. At any rate, so Jay sent me a note and so on, and we talked about this for a while. Let's go to picture number 2, please. All right, this happens to be the original HBR-14, a version that I picked up in a flea market. Now, this is a slightly amended version of the one you saw just a minute ago. Go back one slide to number 1, would you please? All right, notice the dial on that. This is a national dial, but it's not a very good dial, but it's good enough apparently. He was considering costs. All right, now go forward 1. This is what they call an Eddystone 898, I think it is, or some number like that. These command fantastic prices on eBay now, but this is the dial if you can afford one or find one. Well, this happened to be mounted in this HBR that I picked up at a flea market for, I don't know, $15 or so, complete with all the coils. And this is one of the minor changes that came along. Let's go to the next picture. All right, now take a good look at this, because this will show you. Where's the, we got the laser pointer there, Mark? right, let's just do this verbally. Look at the right-hand side of that slide. Take a good look at the coils. They are plug-in coils. Take a good look at the tuning capacitor. This is a 3-section, low-capacity capacitor. This is actually the heart of the receiver. Okay, I didn't think the workmanship on this radio was all that great, but it well illustrates the point. Another point was the transformer right there. 14 tubes requires a lot of filament current, so you have to keep that in mind when you're designing a circuit. The IF cans look like they came out of a BC453 low frequency command receiver. 85 kCIFs. The original Ted Crosby receiver used 100 kCIFs because they were commercially available. You don't need to do that. We'll get into that in a minute. Anyway, take a good look at this front end because this is the key. If you're at a flea market and you see this front end in any homebrew setup and you think, boy, that's an HBR and I'd like to have that. Well, go ahead and grab it if you can get it for a decent price. If you can get one set of coils in it, hey, that's great. If you can get all 5 sets of coils, that's even better. Go to the next picture, please. This is an accumulation of parts by a fellow named Breck Smith, K4CHE, down in Delaware. Now, Breck, for all of his strange name, is a retired Air Force pilot. He is no shrinking violet. He's a very good radio man. He knows his stuff. And we'll get into that in a minute. But these are just the parts that he had. Let's talk about the circuit for a minute and leave that slide up. The circuit of this receiver is nothing more than a classic circuit out of the 1950s and 60s. You guys remember the double conversion circuits that were so popular back then? They had a high frequency IF in the beginning, like 1700 kC, something like that, and then followed by converting down to 100 kC, a very sharp IF to give the selectivity. And that's what the fundamental HBR circuit was. There really wasn't anything unusual about this circuit, except that there was a lot of pots in the thing to control the gain on all the various stages. If you're doing a project, any project, and you've got a magazine article, you better ask yourself, does this guy really know what he's talking about? Am I going to invest the time as well as the money for parts and so on with any assurance that this thing is going to work like he touts it to be? And it's a good idea to sit down and analyze the article thoroughly and start drawing diagrams and start making lists and do a lot of paperwork. And in the process, you will get questions that have to be answered. I've always found that this pays off because sometimes I get halfway through the paperwork and say, I don't want to do this thing. This is before I start drilling holes. Let's talk about finding the parts then, beyond that. Okay, we're going to do this thing. And Breck said, all right, I'm going to build this. I wanted one since I was a kid. The tuning capacitor, well, you can buy the fancy one that Ted Crosby recommended, if you can still find it, or you can get one out of an old FM receiver, out of the 50s, 60s, 70s. Or, let's take it simpler yet. Instead of a 3-gang capacitor, find a small 2-gang capacitor, and then the RF stage, you just put a single independent capacitor and peak that stage, almost like the Collins S-line. You have an antenna trimmer anyway. I haven't tried this, but it sounds like a good idea. The coils, that's tricky. And the reason is that he used plug-in coil forms. Well, for many years, these were no longer available. But I noticed recently that one of the part suppliers is making them available. I think it was an Antique Radio Classified now has them. Some other places have them also. And if you get coil forms that are about the same diameter as these styrene forms that he is recommending, which I happen to have, these things here, they're hard to work with. At any rate, that's what he recommended. So, and I think maybe because that's what all was available, but you will find bud coil forms and others of about the same diameter in the various ham flea markets and so on. I found one today out in the flea market in a box of stuff, and the guy charged me $1 for it. It's a nice 5-pound form, just like this one, only it's much sturdier, and you can solder the thing, the pins and so on, without the plastic distorting. I like them much better than these things, but this is what he asked for, and this is what I'm using. That is the tricky for the coils. They need APC trimmers in them. Well, that's another story. I won't go into that now. But I will say this. Winding the coils is the hardest part of the whole receiver. It's very tricky and tedious business, and you will learn a lot. You will learn how they did it in the old days. They tied the thing around the end of the wire around the doorknob, or they put it, clamped it in a vise, and then you stood and you wound with 2 hands, and you did like this, and you kept going along until you had yourself a coil. And it's really not easy. It takes a little bit of doing, but this is a tedious business. Once you get one set of coils done, hey, you're halfway home there, then you can go ahead and do the rest of it. The other thing I learned to do was that I learned to make a lot of paper templates before I started cutting any aluminum. And I didn't use steel, I use aluminum. It's a lot easier to work with. Paper templates, laying out the parts, all of this is very important to any of these jobs. As far as the IFs, you can get those, or you can make them. The original form used, the original receiver used homebrew 1700 KCIFs. So they are right there, those 2 things. He wound the coils on pill bottles or styrene forms or something. And that's the high frequency IF, and then the low frequency one, I sent him the remains of an old BC 453. He took the IFs out of it, and there they are.